She came out of the dust like a whisper, barefoot, eyes burning, hand trembling on his reins. The Apache woman didn't speak a word, but her intent was clear. She wasn't just stealing a horse. She was stealing her freedom. The cowboy could have drawn his gun. Instead, he lowered it and said 5 words that changed both their fates forever. Ride with me instead. What began as a theft beneath a dying sun would become a journey of redemption, across a land that refused to forgive either of them. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. He rode like a man who had been hollowed out by the years, slow, deliberate, each hoof fell a small surrender to the coming night. The sun sagged behind the far rim, a bruised coin slipping into shadow, and the mason poured red light over everything until the world looked like an old wound. Cole Matthews kept his eyes on the trail because that was what scouts learned, how to read a broken twig, a crushed tuft of grass, the faded print of a boot that should not have been there, and because looking down kept his heart from rising in his throat. His horse was thin, its ribs whispering beneath the saddle. The animal's breath steamed in the cooling air like a small, persistent prayer. From the heat-hazed distance she came as if the wind itself had coughed up a shape, barefoot, hem-torn, hair tangled with burrs, her feet painted with the dust of 100 miles. She moved without the practiced stealth of a thief. There was no light-fingered ease in her steps. There was instead the raw, jagged decision of a person who had already counted every cost and decided to pay the last one. When she reached for his reins, her fingers were open and raw, trembling, not from the danger of the gun at his hip, but from the weight of whatever had driven her to this theft, whatever had made a woman trade silence for the crime of taking another man's horse. He saw the scars on her wrists, pale lines like old barbed wire, saw the hollow under her eyes where sleep had been sold for other people's safety. When her gaze met his, there was lightning, defiance braided with sorrow, and he felt, certainly, that this was not a simple theft but an escape measured by courage. A man in Cole's place might have raised the weapon that had kept him from the neck of the wind these many years. Men like them had been raised on the law of the fastest draw and the coldest judgment. Cole's hand hovered near leather and metal out of habit, then lowered, because something in her stillness was not the hollow arrogance of an outlaw but the desperate geometry of someone pressed up against a cliff and given a sliver of rope. He said, softly, "Ride with me instead." 5 words, no sermon, no bargain, an offer that was both a key and a reckoning. The desert seemed to listen, even the breeze stilled, as if the land itself had paused to witness a small mercy. She did not answer with words, she answered with emotion, a careful, almost imperceptible nod, the tilt of a chin that said she would take the chance and that she would not thank him for the charity of it. Her silence was a whole language, suspicion, fear, the hard knowledge that white men could be as cruel as any trader in the river towns. Yet she stepped closer, grounding her palm on the flank of the horse as if to anchor herself to something that did not breathe betrayal. Cole watched the line of her jaw, the way she breathed, the tiny flinch when a vulture wheeled in the distance. He thought then, not of the town ahead or the money in his pocket, but of names that had become knives in his chest, names of those he'd failed, of a daughter lost to fever, of a boy he'd once shot because war had taught him to see threat in every figure that moved. The offer hung between them like an unspoken covenant. He would not hand her over to whoever had sold her, and she would not make a break for it that might mean death. The horse shifted, impatient, and Cobb, as the animal had been called in kinder days, tossed its head as if agreeing to this strange compact. Together they became a picture of impossible hope, a ragged woman and a tired man poised at the edge of choice, 2 people who could have chosen the easy cruelty of turning away but instead chose a path that would bind their fates. As the sun finally bled into night, Cole cinched the saddle just a notch tighter, lifted his hat with emotion that was neither triumphant nor ashamed, and led the horse down the trail. The dust swallowed their tracks, the sky leaned down like a witness, and in the small, fragile space between heartbeats the desert taught them the first rule that would carry them both. Sometimes freedom is stolen not with force but with an offered hand. The trail stretched before them like an old scar, sun-baked and endless, the kind of land that remembered everything men tried to forget. Cole Matthews rode with his shoulders tight, one hand always near his holster, though he told himself it was only habit. The Apache woman, Nita, though he didn't yet know her name, rode a few paces behind, silent as moonlight on a grave. She moved like she belonged to the land, not as someone traveling through it, but as part of its memory, one of those restless spirits the wind carried from canyon to canyon. The air between them felt thin, ready to shatter with the wrong word or the wrong look. Even the horse seemed to sense it, its ears flicking back with every crunch of gravel, every whisper of wind that might have been pursuit. The sun hung low, baking the horizon into a mirage that quivered like a fever dream. Cole felt the weight of her presence without turning, her eyes always moving, searching the ridges, the sky, the earth. She expected someone. Men, maybe. The kind that hunt without mercy. The kind Cole had once ridden with. When she shifted her arm to adjust the reins, he caught sight of the marks on her skin, red lines wrapping her wrists like the ghosts of shackles, the angry memory of rope that had bitten too deep. Rope burns. His gut twisted, not from pity but from the sick recognition of what men did when they decided they owned something that breathed. She wasn't a thief, she was running from a brand burned into her life. The realization didn't make her less dangerous, it made her more so. Desperation could drive a soul to do anything. He'd seen soldiers throw down their guns and charge cannons rather than go back to chains of regret. The silence between them was heavy but not empty. It held questions neither dared to ask. Who are you running from? What did they take from you? Why did I let you ride beside me? The desert answered none of it. It only whispered through the brush and carried dust into their mouths. When they reached a dry creek bed, Cole dismounted, crouching to read the earth like scripture. Tracks, faint, but fresh. Horses, maybe 3, maybe 4. He looked back. Her face didn't change, but her eyes tightened like she already knew. She always knew. Cole thought about sending her away, but the thought of leaving her there in the open, barefoot, wounded, hunted, sat wrong in his chest. He wasn't a savior. Hell, he barely qualified as a man with his own horse. Yet there was something about her defiance, the way she met every sound with her chin slightly raised, that made him believe she deserved the chance he never got. They mounted again without a word. Dusk swallowed the land, painting the rocks in bruised light. The smell of sage rose thick as smoke. Cole's hand brushed the rifle strap to his saddle, not to use it but to remember it was there, the last familiar thing left in the world that kept changing shape. He glanced at her silhouette, a streak of shadow against fading red, and thought how strange it was that fear and trust could ride the same trail. When the stars began to appear, he spoke, his voice gravel soft. If you've got someone after you, they're close. She didn't answer, just tilted her head toward the dark hills ahead. He followed her gaze and saw nothing, but his pulse knew better. She wasn't afraid for herself, she was afraid for him. The thought made something shift in him, a small, reluctant spark of duty. The land ahead was merciless, the kind that punished hesitation, but Cole didn't turn back. He felt the fragile truce between them like glass in his hands, thin, beautiful, ready to break. And though he couldn't explain why, he knew that once it did, one of them would bleed for it. The night deepened, the sky widened, and somewhere behind them, the sound of a distant horse echoed once, then faded, swallowed by the memory of the land that never forgot. Night fell like a blanket pulled tight across the ribs of the world, and the desert changed its voice from harsh proclamation to low, secreted breath. They made camp in a hollow between two weathered ridges, and the fire they coaxed to life sat like a small, stubborn heart against the dark, spitting sparks that rose and vanished like answers no one would ever hear, while shadows folded and refolded themselves over the pair until each movement seemed freighted with meaning. Cole watched her not as a man who counted people for sport but as a man who had been marked by his own mistakes, watching the way the flame drew hollows under her cheekbones, the way the light trembled across the pale lines on her wrists where rope had once bit, and in that study he discovered the outline of a life that had been traded in whispers and ledgers rather than lived. She watched the fire with the habitual vigilance of someone who expected pursuit at any hour, her eyes scanning ridgelines and sky as if reading the world for the shape of footsteps, the tiniest change in wind, because survival had taught her to translate the land into danger and shelter at the same glance. The night brought every old thing with it, the distant cry of a coyote, the soft, disembodied shuffle of a horse trying to find comfort in a place with none, and inside Cole's ribs a memory rose like smoke. The name of a town where men sold more than goods. The flash of a boy's face before a trigger was pulled in a night that still tasted of iron and dust. The fevered weight of a daughter's breath gone cold years ago, and those recollections crouched at his throat like hungry beasts. She spoke once, when the fire was a low chorus of dying clicks, and the word cut the dark bluntly like a knife. Sold. The single syllable landed between them and refused to be dressed up. Sold. Flesh. Fate. A life bartered like a horse at market. Declared plainly the commerce of cruelty that men had been running under the same sky for decades, and it rearranged the small truths Cole had been carrying about himself. He felt then that he had not merely offered a passage to another soul but had stepped, unwillingly perhaps, into a reckoning whose sum he had not yet measured. She did not tell him how long she had been owned or what names had been stitched into the contracts that bound her people and accounts no law would ever account for. Instead, she let the firelight show him the scars, let the silence answer the questions she could not bear to speak aloud, and in that silence Cole heard confessions that had no voice, regret, the weight of choices made in trenches of hunger, the stubborn, terrible courage of a woman who would rather risk a gunman's bullet than the slow death of remaining where she was. He thought about leaving, about riding away into the night and letting the wind swallow the memory of her bare feet on his horse and of the look of someone who had been used up and then discarded. But the image of that moment when she first emerged from the dust, stubborn and raw with resolve, kept returning like a small, bright wound he could not let heal without tending. He considered what kindness meant in a place that taught men to bargain with suffering, and he found, shamefully perhaps, that even his mercies felt like debts. They traded no plans that night. Map reading would have been blasphemy against fate, and naming roads felt like tempting the ledger to call their number. So they did instead what the desperate and honest do. They traded pieces of themselves in small, quiet proofs. A scar described without excuses, a town mentioned like an offering, the nickname of a child tucked into memory like a prayer, each revelation a stepping stone across the fragile span forming between them. The fire burned low and the mesquite whispered, and neither slept. They kept watch over one another with the wary tenderness of people who know their histories are lined with violence and yet want to believe, foolishly or bravely, that some hard-won truce might be possible. When the stars then toward dawn and the cold deepened into a clawing ache, Cole slipped his hat over his eyes and listened to the desert hold its breath with them, understanding in a way he had not before that they were not merely fleeing men who traded in human lives but also running from the heavier things inside themselves, guilt, the hunger for absolution, the rusted anchors of memory, and that the path ahead would demand more than a vision. It would demand that they learn to carry one another's ghosts until those ghosts learn to walk a little lighter. The morning broke hard and honest, thin light sharpening the ridges and throwing the world into brittle relief. Cole sat up slow, felt the chill in his bones, and the desert answered with a language he'd learned to read. Prints in the dust, hollows cupped like small graves, and there it was, a line of hoof marks trailing them. 3 riders measured by the weight impressed on the earth and the even spacing that told him they rode not for sport but for business. The sight of those tracks pulled the small, sensible scripts a man like him kept, turned back, hide, bargain for coin, and then collapsed them under a heavier truth. Someone who owned a woman enough to mark her as property did not stop for sentiment. Cole traced the grooves with a fingertip as if they might whisper names, and the little facts stacked up. The deep heel of the first print suggested a heavy boot. The offset of the second showed a limp in one horse as if the rider had been long on the road, and the third was oddly close to the first, like a shadow keeping the watch. Whoever they were organized and merciless. He felt, without drama, the balance of choices tilt in his head, turn Nita loose under the sky and save his hide, or turn toward the riders and risk the kind of dying that leaves more than a body behind. She stood by the fire, a silhouette against the pale light, hands tucked into her skirt as if bracing against the cold and the way people could become a currency in some men's ledgers. Her face betrayed nothing, no pleading, no artifice, only that calm of someone who had been made to measure the cost of every motion so often that motion had become its own prayer. When he looked at the rope marks still faint on her wrists, he thought of the ledger rooms in river towns where men with bad hats and worse consciences signed ownership over other people like cattle and where the law was a thing you paid for if you could afford it. Cole thought of his own ledger, death chalked into the bone of his heart, and how the simple act of offering a horse had become an act stacked with consequence. She could have run the moment he blinked, could have taken the animal and pinned her life to speed and luck. But she waited, and the waiting was a question. Will you keep me or will you sell me back to silence? He considered words, offer her money, hand her to the nearest deputy, muttered a justification to himself, and found them hollow. Instead, his hands moved to the saddle, fingers sure, tightening straps with the careful deliberation of a man who knew that preparation and resolve sometimes spoke louder than bravado. We ride north, he said, and the sound of it surprised him. Short, without flourish, the sort of small command that can either save or damn a man. He did not ask her if she wanted to go, because her eyes had already chosen, and in that choice there was a kind of acceptance that was itself a pact. She nodded once, barely, as if the nod were a currency used to buy forward motion, and when she swung up into the saddle there was no fanfare, only the raw geometry of two people taking up the same road. They left the shallow campsite like two ghosts folding into the early smoke, and behind them the tracks lay open and patient, the rider's intentions unread but imminent. The chase that began was not only toward the hills and the scrub that would test their horses and their nerves, it was toward a place neither of them had defined in words yet, toward a reckoning that would reveal whether an offer of mercy could survive where laws failed. As they rode, Cole kept glancing back at the thin line of prints until the horizon swallowed them. The desert whispered that whatever came next would be bought with blood or bravery, and both of them felt, in their separate ways, that for the first time since grief had taught them to hold their hands like weapons, they were riding for something larger than escape, something like atonement. They slipped into the canyon like two secrets folding into a book no one else could open, the walls closing in with the intimate hush of a confessional, and sound itself turned traitor, every footstep a shout, every whisper a proclamation, so that Cole felt his breath multiply and echo back at him until it seemed the gorge was breathing for them both. Nita moved ahead with a surety that erased the maps Cole had memorized as a scout. She threaded through slits and under overhangs, stepping where his eyes saw only rock, and with each bend the canyon swallowed a little more of the world they were fleeing, replacing sky with a rough palm of stone and the smell of sun-baked liacan. The place was old as memory and unforgiving as law, and it suited him, a shelter for fugitives and a stage for the past to come calling. Cole watched her shadow move, quick, compact, like a hunted animal that had learned to hide in plain sight, and something in him that had been coiled tight for years began to loosen because here, where the land remembered its own scars, she seemed less like prey and more like a god who could translate danger. He wanted to ask her how she knew this route, what village or elder had taught her the hush of these passages, but the canyon had its own etiquette. Questions were reckless currency and could be heard by ears 2 ridges away. Then, as if the stone itself had tired of silence, a crack split the air, a rifle barked high and sharp, hurled down the corridor of rock like a thrown voice, and the canyon answered by making it tenfold louder, an explosion of sound that knocked the breath from Cole's chest and turned blood to lead in his veins. Nita's body was a lesson in speed. She flattened against the wall and motioned without speaking, one hand cutting the air in a slice that meant go low. Go now. Her fingers were pained and sure, as if every motion had been practiced against the necessity of survival. Cole felt the old soldier's reflex take him, knees, shoulder, sight, and moved with a muscle memory that tasted of mud and winter campaigns. He rolled behind a chipped boulder, the cool stone biting his palm, and peered through the slit where light leaked in. The pursuers were there. 3 riders halted at the canyon's mouth, rifles raised like the hands of men making a benediction to violence. They were close enough that Cole could see the brass of sunburn, belt buckles, and the slick, comfortable cruelty in their faces. He did not think long. Thinking was for men who could afford time. His finger found the trigger with the grim politeness of someone used to killing as a business, and he squeezed. The shot cracked like a whip and the canyon swallowed it whole and spat it back at them, but it landed true. The first man flinched, stumbled, and fell from his horse in a tangle of limbs and dust. The other 2 backed off in a mere step of caution and anger, cursing into their mustaches, then spurred their mounts into the scrub and vanished with a last hard look that promised return. The silence that followed their retreat was not relief. It was the kind of hush that carries a scent, dense, expectant, full of the shape of things left undone. Nita didn't speak. Her hands trembled just enough that Cole could see the memory of rope in every twitch, but the tremor eased when she turned and met his gaze. For a moment time thinned to the span of 2 breathing bodies, his astonishment, her exhaustion, and in that pause something like trust passed between them. quick and fragile as a sparrow's wing. It was not the solid hammer of brotherhood. It was the softer, more dangerous thing, reliance. He saw it in the slope of her shoulders, in the way her jaw unclenched, as if the fight had been a test neither had wanted to take, and she judged him not by the shot he fired but by the fact that he had fired it to make sure she could live. Around them the canyon kept its counsel. Wind threaded through cracks and carried with it an old smell, dried blood, rain that had long ago fallen, the faint resin of pinyon, and Cole felt the ledger of his life tilt again under the weight of choices: protect, or walk away and let the ledger balance itself with other men's sins. He did not speak the answer. Words felt too brittle for the cockless of survival. Instead he rose, bones complaining, and offered the small, practical ministrations of someone who knew wounds and horses and the quiet arithmetic of keeping going. He checked the saddle, eased a bandage from his pack to press to a graze on Nita's hand, and in the simple touch there was confirmation. They would move on together. As they threaded deeper into the canyon's mouth, the echoing walls closed behind them like a judge's book snapping shut, and Cole rode with a new, strange knowledge that the worst of the chase had passed for now, but that the canyon had recorded their names in its memory, and names, once written in a land that never forgot, were the sort of thing other men would come back to collect. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. Alright then, let's get back on the trail. The night came soft, folding itself around them like a shawl woven from the size of the canyon wind, and for the first time since they'd met, the silence did not bite. It hummed, low and warm, like the breath of a campfire learning to trust its own flame. Cole sat across from her, elbows on knees, watching the light flicker against her face, the shadows sculpting her features into something ancient and undeigned, a profile that might have been carved into the stone walls around them. The fire popped, spitting sparks that drifted upward, tiny stars trying to find their sky again. Between them lay the dust and blood of what they had endured, the chase, the gunfire, the narrow escape, and though neither spoke, both understood that survival was a conversation of its own. When he finally broke the quiet, it was not with command or curiosity, but with a question that sounded almost like a prayer. "What do I call you?" His voice came out rougher than intended, but beneath the gravel there was something gentler, a man trying to name what had already begun to matter. She hesitated, her eyes lifting to meet his, cautious as a deer caught between instinct and trust. The wind toyed with her hair, and in that shifting light, she looked younger, though her gaze carried a weight that no age could measure. "Nita," she said at last, the word leaving her lips like a confession. "It means bear." She spoke the translation not for him, but as if reminding herself what her name still meant: strength hidden in quietness, endurance without roar. The name settled between them, and Cole repeated it under his breath, careful not to bruise it. Nita. It suited her, not because it was soft, but because it carried a kind of power that didn't need proving. For a moment, he said nothing more, only nodded, as though acknowledging an introduction to someone the desert itself had sent. When he finally spoke again, his words carried the slow rhythm of a man on earth in his own history from under too much dust. "Cole Matthews," he said, "used to be a Union scout. Now I just drift." He didn't tell her how many years it had been since it stopped belonging anywhere, or how the name Maddox had once been spoken with pride before whiskey and grief ground it into something men whispered instead. He didn't say that the name carried ghosts, that a wife and child lay under the earth of Missouri, or that his trigger fingers still remembered the tremor of killing an Apache boy too young to have known war. But Nita looked at him as though she could already see the ledger of his sins written behind his eyes, and she didn't flinch. She only nodded, mirroring his quiet, and said softly, "Names are heavy things. Some you're born with, some you earn." Cole stared into the fire until the heat blurred his vision, unsure if the sting in his eyes was from smoke or shame. The flames painted her in shifting hues, sometimes fierce, sometimes fragile, and he realized that for all the miles they'd ridden, this was the first time they had truly arrived anywhere, a moment of stillness that felt like belonging. The canyon seemed to listen too, even the wind fell to a murmur, as if unwilling to interrupt. They didn't need to say more. The telling of names had become a ritual, binding without ceremony, a vow made not in words but in understanding. In the glow between them, Cole felt the weight in his chest ease, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, fragile as glass but real enough to breathe. He leaned back, letting the firelight wash over him, and when he glanced at her again, she was watching the stars, her face serene, her name echoing softly in his mind. Nita, the bear who carried her pain without roaring. And he, Cole Mathix, the drifter who had forgotten how to stand still. For the first time, their silence wasn't the distance of strangers. It was a bridge, built from loss, lit by fire, and strong enough to hold two broken souls who no longer needed to run from what they were. The night had thinned to a pale mist by the time they reached the San Pedro, its banks swollen and restless with the memory of spring rain. The river moved like a living thing, dark and heaving, pulling at the moonlight as if it meant to drown it. Cole reined in the horse at the edge, studying the churned current that whispered of broken legs and sunken bones, and for a long moment neither spoke. The water's voice was enough. Then Nita said quietly, "We crossed before dawn." Her tone held no room for argument, only the weary authority of someone who knew the land's moods better than she knew her own reflection. Cole looked at her, at the determination carved into her face by fear and something fiercer, and nodded, though every part of him told him this was folly. He'd crossed rivers before, rivers filled with ice, rivers filled with blood, but this one felt different, as if it was testing whether he deserved to make it to the other side. He dismounted, tightening the girth on the saddle, feeling the leather strain against his grip. Nita placed a hand on the horse's neck, whispering something in her language, a sound soft and low as the first breath before sunrise. Cole didn't ask what she said. Some prayers weren't meant to be translated. They stepped into the river together, water rising fast past their knees, then their thighs, the current dragging at them with a hungry insistence. The horse snorted, shivering, each step a negotiation between will and terror. Cole gritted his teeth and kept one hand on the reins, the other outstretched toward Nita, though she didn't take it. She just kept her gaze fixed on the far bank, the faint line of shadow where trees began again, where maybe the promise of escape waited. The sound came before the danger, a faint metallic cough that only men who've lived too long with guns recognize, and then, crack. The bullet sliced the river's skin beside them, sending up a spray that glittered briefly in the dawn's half-light before the current erased it. Cole spun instinctively, shouting, "Down!" But the river had its own grip on their balance. Another shot tore through the air, ricocheting off stone. The horse reared, terrified, dragging Nita sideways into the current. Cole lunged, catching her arm just as the rein slipped from his hand, his boot slamming against an unseen rock. Pain flared, hot and bright, but he stayed upright. He drew his pistol with the steadiness of a man who'd done it too often to think about it, and fired once, then again, aiming not with precision but with fury. One of the riders on the far ridge jerked, arms flailing, and tumbled from his saddle into the river, the sound of his fall swallowed by the roar of water. The current took him quickly, spinning him into the bend like a toy, and for a heartbeat Cole thought he saw the man's face flash pale in the current before it vanished entirely, another offering to the desert's letter. The others hesitated, shots faltering, then retreated back into the blur of trees, unwilling to follow where the river demanded payment. Cole shoved Nita forward, half dragging her through the last stretch until their boots hit solid ground. They collapsed on the far bank, soaked, shaking, gasping like creatures pulled back from death's throat. The horse staggered out behind them, sides heaving, its eyes wild and rolling. Cole dropped to his knees, chest burning, hands still tight around the gun though the fight was gone. Nita lay beside him, water dripping from her hair, her breath ragged but steady. For a long moment they said nothing, just listened to the river claim its silence again. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, "He will not follow." Cole nodded, unsure whether she meant the man or fate itself. The dawn broke then, thin, uncertain, the color of tarnished silver, and he looked at her through it, at the woman who had once been a stranger stealing his horse and now stood, drenched and trembling, bound even by something heavier than chance. Survival, he thought, was no longer a solitary act. It had become a covenant, sealed not by words, but by the river that had nearly taken them both and yet, somehow, had spared them instead. The grove rose before them like a secret, a tangle of juniper and ghost grass whispering beneath the wind, the kind of place travelers passed without noticing unless the land itself wanted them to stop. Cole felt it first, a stillness different from rest, the way the air thickened as though memory itself hung suspended there. The cabin waited at the heart of it, small, sunken, more ruin than refuge, its roof half collapsed under years of rain and time. The door swung open on its own side when Cole pushed it, and the smell inside was old wood, ash, and something faintly sweet, like wild sage burned in prayer. Dust motes drifted in the thin shafts of light, and each one seemed heavy with what had once been laughter, warmth, the echo of a family that had tried to carve a home out of the wilderness and failed. Nita stepped past him, her bare feet almost soundless, her eyes moving slow, deliberate, as though she feared to disturb the ghosts still holding the walls upright. Cole stayed back, leaning his shoulder against the doorframe, hat low, letting her read the room in her own way. There was a cradle near the hearth, blackened by fire but still rocking faintly when the wind touched it, and beside it, half buried in ash, two tiny shoes no longer white, their leather shriveled like fruit left too long in the sun. A photograph leaned against the mantel, faces barely visible, smoke-stained smiles of a man, woman, and child who had once believed in permanence. Cole's throat tightened around a memory he hadn't meant to summon, his own girl's laughter chasing the sound of rain against the window in Missouri, her fevered breath cooling beneath his trembling hand. He closed his eyes for half a heartbeat, and when he opened them again, Nita was crouched by the hearth, sifting through a scatter of broken things, buttons, a thimble, the brittle remains of letters that had become powder. In the debris, she found a locket, its chain blackened but intact. She wiped it clean with the corner of her shawl, careful as if handling bone, and the metal caught the firelight like an ember refusing to die. When she opened it, the hinge creaked softly, and inside was a faint trace of two faces, one large, one small, perhaps a mother and child, faded to near invisibility. Her fingers trembled just enough that the locket swayed on its chain, and her expression, though unreadable, carried the weight of something sacred. Cole stepped closer, slowly, as though approaching a wounded animal. "You can keep it," he said, voice low, almost an apology. She didn't answer, but her gaze flickered toward him, brief, acknowledging, and then back to the locket, which she closed and held against her chest, whispering a single word in Apache too soft for him to catch. Maybe a name, maybe a prayer. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of ghosts, all of them listening. Cole let his eyes wander the cabin again, seeing not just what was left but what had been taken, the violence of the raid, the desperation of flight, the cruel symmetry of loss that made strangers kin whether they wanted it or not. He saw his own failures mirrored in the blackened wood, and the realization hit him with a slow, dull ache, how every man who rode west was trying to outrun some version of this ruin, how the frontier didn't erase pain, it only spread it thinner across the land. He sank down onto a fallen beam, the weight of his revolver pressing against his thigh like a reminder of all the things he couldn't fix. The firelight caught in Nita's hair as she sat opposite him, the locket glinting between her fingers, and for the first time, Cole saw not the fugitive woman or the survivor, but something gentler, a daughter of the earth, orphaned by cruelty, still choosing to remember when forgetting might have been easier. The past and present blurred until they felt like the same wound reopened. He looked away first, afraid that if he kept staring, he might see his little girl's face flicker in the glow where Nita sat. Outside, the wind picked up, sighing through the juniper trees like a mother calling her children home. Inside the cabin of ashes, two souls sat surrounded by what the fire hadn't taken, and for a moment, the emptiness itself felt holy, like grief had finally found a place to rest. The fire burned low, all crackle and sigh, a weary heart beating against the hush of the canyon night. The stars above stretched wide and merciless, each one sharp enough to cut through memory, and Cole felt every one of them pressing down on him as though the heavens themselves demanded a reckoning. He sat hunched near the embers, a silhouette carved from guilt, while Nita rested across from him, her knees drawn close, the faint gleam of the locket at her throat pulsing with each flicker of flame. They hadn't spoken much since finding the cabin, and in the silence, the ghosts of both their pasts had crept closer, circling the edges of the fire like wolves too patient to show teeth. Cole ran a hand over his jaw, the roughness of stubble grounding him in the present, but his mind kept slipping backward, to the smell of gunpowder, to the metallic taste of regret that never left his mouth. "You ever try to forget something?" he said, his voice hoarse and uncertain. "But it just keeps following you anyway?" The question wasn't meant for her, but she looked up all the same, the dark pools of her eyes reflecting the firelight. "What do you want to forget?" she asked, her tone neither soft nor hard, just steady, the way truth always sounded when spoken without judgment. Cole exhaled slowly, the breath shuddering out of him like confession fighting its way free. "There was a boy," he said. "Apache. Couldn't have been more than 12. The war made us see enemies everywhere, every shadow, every sudden move. He came out from the brush one morning, hands full of berries. I thought he had a weapon." The words cracked, dry and uneven, scraping his throat raw as he forced them out. "I didn't wait. I shot first." He paused, watching the fire devour another stick, the flame curling upward like a scream swallowed by the sky. "He fell before I even knew what I'd done. And when I got to him..." His hands trembled. He was still clutching the berries. For a long time after that, there was no sound except the wind moving through the juniper branches, whispering like some old spirit trying to soothe the living. Nita didn't move closer, didn't offer touch or pity, just listen, her eyes unwavering, her presence a quiet permission for him to continue breathing. "The men said I did right," Cole murmured. "Said I saved us from an ambush. But every night since, I see his face before I close my eyes. The war ended, but that moment didn't. It's like the bullet never stopped. It's still moving, through me, through everything." He laughed then, a bitter, broken sound. "I tried drowning it with whiskey, with distance, figured if I rode far enough west, I could leave him buried behind me." His gaze found hers again, searching for something, punishment, maybe, or release. "But you can't outrun the dead, can you?" Nita tilted her head, the firelight glancing off her cheekbones, painting her in shades of bronze and sorrow. "No," she said simply. "You cannot heal the land by more killing." The words were gentle, but they struck like thunder in his chest. He opened his mouth, ready to argue, to defend the years of violence as duty, survival, but the argument died before it could form. She was right, and the weight of that truth settled on him heavier than any bullet he'd carried. He bowed his head, the firelight etching lines of remorse into his face. "I thought I was a man of justice," he whispered. "Turns out I was just another man with a gun." Nita studied him for a long, wordless moment, then spoke, her voice as soft as the wind through the canyon. "You can still choose what kind of man you die as." It wasn't forgiveness, not the easy kind, but something deeper, harder earned. It didn't absolve him, it simply allowed him to breathe without choking on his own shame. Outside, the night wind rose, brushing through the trees, carrying with it a low hum that felt almost holy, like the world itself offering a prayer for the undeserving. Cole looked at Nita then, not as a fugitive or as someone he'd saved, but as the mirror that reflected back the part of him he'd tried to bury. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone with his ghosts. He felt the possibility, faint but real, that maybe they could be laid to rest, not by running, not by killing, but by the fragile mercy of being seen and still allowed to exist. The morning came thin and cold, the kind that crept into your bones before you were awake enough to fight it. And when Cole stirred from the shallow edge of sleep, the quiet was wrong. Too wide, too hollow. The ashes of their fire had gone gray, the air still holding the ghost of smoke. But the sound that should have been there, the slow shifting of hooves, the comforting snort of Cobb's breath, was gone. His hand shot to his holster before his mind caught up. The camp was empty except for the imprint of her body on the dirt beside his, already fading under the wind. Panic came next, sharp and ugly. He called her name once, Nita, and the canyon walls tossed it back at him like a taunt. Then he saw them, the faint, deliberate prints leading away from camp, light and quick, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping guild. Betrayal was the first thought to strike him, clean and vicious. He'd trusted her, told her his sins, offered her his last piece of humanity, and she'd taken his horse and vanished into the dawn. He knelt to read the tracks closer. The story in them was strange, no sign of hurry, no stagger from panic, just purpose, as if she'd walked willingly into the throat of something dark. A low growl of wind cut across the plain, carrying with it the distant scent of wood smoke. Cole turned toward it, squinting into the rising light. On the far horizon, a thread of smoke twisted against the sky, black and deliberate. His chest went still. They were there, the riders who had hunted her since the desert, the men who thought a person could be owned. He saw the way the prince curved east, not toward safety, but straight toward that column of smoke. She hadn't stolen the horse. She'd gone to them, alone, to draw them away from him. The realization cracked something in him clean down the middle. For a long moment, he just stood there, breathing hard, staring at the horizon as the sun crawled higher and painted everything in cruel gold. Then the old part of him, the scout, the soldier, the killer he'd tried to leave behind, took over. He broke camp fast, his hands steady though his insides felt like glass. He loaded the rifle, tightened the belt at his waist, and slung his canteen across his shoulder. Every movement was a prayer, a promise. He found Cobb's trail where the grass bent low, followed it to where the animal's prints mixed with boot marks he didn't recognize. The men had her. He could see it now. They'd found her in the half-light, probably still leading them in circles to buy him time, and she'd gone quiet, the way only the brave or the doomed could. He pictured her eyes, that calm defiance that never needed words, and something old and merciless stirred in his chest. Not vengeance, not anymore, but the ghost of what he once believed redemption might look like if a man could earn it. He mounted what was left to ride, a half-broken mule from the abandoned cabin, and kicked it into motion. The land stretched wide and empty before him, but he rode like a man chasing his own heartbeat. Dust rose around him in choking waves, the sun climbing higher with every mile, and in his ears the pulse of hoofs matched the drumbeat of one thought: he would not let her die for him. Not her. The wind caught at his coat, tearing it back like a flag of war. Each ridge he crested brought him closer to the smoke, closer to the reckoning he'd been running from since Missouri. Somewhere ahead, she was standing against the men who believed they owned her life, and he was done being the man who watched the innocent die. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, but right, as though it had been waiting for this one righteous use. The sun flared hard off the canyon rim as it pressed on, jaw set, eyes burning with the light of something dangerous but clean. The trail ahead shimmered in the heat, but for the first time, he wasn't running from the ghosts that haunted him. He was riding straight into them, to meet them head on, to earn the right to stop hearing that boy's dying breath, to be the man who didn't pull the trigger too late this time. And as the smoke swelled larger, curling into the open sky, Cole Mathix rode faster, the dust rising behind him like a promise kept. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then. Let's get back on the trail. He rode into the arroyo with one purpose. 3 men ringed a smoking pit and Nita stood at the center, shoulders squared and unafraid. The leader's palm bore trader's brand, proof that men here counted people as property, and seeing it stirred a cold resolve in Cole. He dismounted with practiced silence, rifle and pistol ready. The first shot split the air and the canyon threw it back, then it became motion, steel and dust in quick calculations of life and death. One man lunged. Cole's bullet stopped him, dust blooming where the man fell. Another fired and a round grazed Cole's shoulder, hot and sharp, but he did not drop. The third tried to circle and the rider fell when Cole met him with steady aim. The leader rushed like a madman and went down hard, breath escaping as if the arroyo took it for its ledger. When the dust settled, the 3 lay still, their trade and people ended on a slope of earth. Cole sank to a knee, the bell of pain in his shoulder loud and immediate, and victory felt less like cleansing and more like balance paid in blood. Nita was there in a second, pressing cloth to his wound, murmuring prayers in Apache that landed like rain. Her hands worked with a practiced care born of necessity, finding his pulse and holding it while the world narrowed to the sound of his breath. He tasted iron at his lip and tried to make sense of the arithmetic of what he'd done. One life taken in anger, another saved by aim, and found the tally uneasy. When he spoke it was small. I should have stopped them sooner. She shook her head, a quiet that held no praise and no blame. You were there, she said. You did not let them take me. It was not absolution, it was recognition, heavy as any oath. Cole thought of the boy he had killed years before, of the ledger that never balanced, and felt for the first time a shift towards something like atonement. Not the clean sword sung about in town, but the raw, dangerous work of choosing otherwise. Nita's hands trembled as adrenaline Evan's sorrow arrived. She pressed the rag harder and looked at him with eyes that were fierce and gentle at once. Around them the arroyo watched, birds on broken limbs, the sun leaning in like a witness, and in that held space, Cole felt consequence instead of endless guilt. He let his head rest against warm stone and allowed the pain to anchor him in the present, a truth he could not run from. Nita kept her hands on his shoulder, steady as an oath, and her prayers drifted into the canyon where perhaps the land itself took note. This blood had been shed not for profit but to stop a trade in lives, and maybe the difference meant something. He remembered the boy's face again, not a blur but a small thing shaped by sun and fear, and the memory hit him like a wave. He had ridden west to outrun that image, but distance did not erase it. Facing these men, seeing their trade end at his hand, felt less like absolution and more like a ledger entry he could not undo. Yet in the rag between Nita's fingers he found something that resembled mercy, careful pressure on the wound, a prayer in a language he did not own. Pain hummed through his arm, a fierce, honest note that kept him present, and he let it. He promised, in a small private way, to try to choose differently next time. The canyon held its hush as if listening to that private vow. They buried the men beneath the red bruise of sunset, shallow graves cut into hard earth because time would not wait for ceremony. Each shovel thrown like a small, furious prayer. The sun leaned down and stained the mesa in the color of old wounds while Cole, pale from blood and grit, watched the dirt fall as if it could weigh the rightness of what had been done. Nita stood a little apart, fingers smelling of gun oil and juniper, the locket at her throat warm, and when the last clod thudded the arroyo seemed the quiet, as if the land itself had accepted the accounting. He stepped to her then, the motion slow and honest, as if admitting something he could not claim another way. "Take the horse," he told her, voice cracked by pain and thin hope. "Ride north. Find water in a town that doesn't keep people on a tally." The offer was not surrender but mercy. Gift her the one thing that could buy distance from men who thought themselves owners. For a beat she did not answer. The wind wheeled through the juniper like an old opinion and the sky burned low overhead. Cole imagined her galloping into open country, the locket flashing like a small sun, and felt both relief and a selfish, unnamed loss. Then she surprised him. "I ride with you," she said, as steady as the first time he'd offered her the same words, and in the echo he heard the bargain shift. The sentence folded onto itself and became a vow, her refusal to be freed into exile, her choosing instead to share whatever dangers lay ahead. He had offered escape because he thought it kind. She refused because kindness without company would be abandonment. Cole crouched and touched the horse's flank. Cobb snorted and stamped, uncaring of graves or promises, only of usefulness. The desert wind moved through them, carrying the scent of burned grass and old blood, and in that thin sound he felt the fragile shape of something resembling peace. He wanted to argue, to insist she go, to be noble in abandonment, but the sight of her steadying the saddle, tightening straps with hands that had known chains, undid his arguments with a tenderness more dangerous than grief. When she reached for his sleeve, it was not to push him away but to anchor him to what was left. "We ride together," she added, as if stating a fact that made the world more bearable. Cole laughed once then, a small wet sound that startled even him, relief braided with sorrow, and for the first time in days he smiled without the shadow of pain. They wrapped the bodies as best they could, left a handful of stones as markers, and slid into the saddles as the horizon swallowed the dying light. The tracks they left were fresh and narrow, a testament to a choice made and remade with every mile. As they moved, the red sky behind them held their vow like a secret, two silhouettes moving away from burial toward a life neither could promise but both had chosen. The wind seemed to carry the vow ahead of them, a private benediction stitched into the emptiness of the desert. Cole thought of names, his daughter, the boy he'd killed, and felt the old ledger shift, not balanced, not absolved, but altered by an act that mattered. He had chosen to keep rather than destroy. Nita's hand found his as they rode. The touch was simple, a promise without words. The mesa swallowed their forms, and the first stars came like witnesses. Under the red sky they carried with them a quiet covenant. Whatever came, they would face it together. They arrived at the mission near dusk, the chapel's whitewashed walls worn to bone, and an old priest opened the door with hands that had tended many ills. He cleaned Cole's wound with boiled water and herbs, wrapped the shoulder tight, and spoke plainly. The border lay a day's hard ride north, and beyond it paper mattered more than purse. Those practical directions felt like a map to relief. They lingered a week. The mission offered work in small kindnesses. Cole stacked firewood, hauled water, and fixed a squeaking gate while Nita climbed the chapel roof with sure, careful motions to set tiles so the bell would not drown in rain. The chores were plain liturgies: mending a rafter, patching an altar cloth, sharing stew, and each steady motion stitched their nerves into something like rhythm. Children watched Nita at the rafters and edged closer when she laughed. The rare, soft sound loosened something in Cole's chest. The land answered their pause, the well filled true after spring rains. The garden by the chapel brightened, and scrub that had been brittle showed hints of green, as if the earth itself approved this fragile peace. The priest did not sermonize. He drew routes in coal and spoke cautions: cross at dawn, favor gullies the patrols glance at and not the open road. His advice came with a candle and a small, practical map, and when he said the word freedom it sounded less like promise and more like work. Nita learned market trades, mending nets, sewing linens, earning coin folded into a scrap of cloth. Each saved coin felt like buying back a piece of life. The fisher's wife who taught her trusted her enough to offer regular work, and each piece of cloth or bread she earned became a small, accumulating liberty. Cole, who had spent years running, found himself tethered by routine. He laughed with the children, answered neighbors' barbs with crooked humor, and slept nights that were measured by bread and labor rather than by distance to the next ridge. The priest watched with quiet approval, offering no miracles but the steadiness of witness. Before they left, Nita made a neat row of stitches in the altar cloth and tucked a sprig of juniper beneath the cross, a small benediction left for the house that sheltered them. The villagers gave practical gifts: salted fish wrapped in cloth, a hand-carved whistle, a candle blessed by the priest. Those tokens were not riches but proof of welcome. On the morning they rode north, the mission folk lined the lane, farmers tipping hats, children scattering petals, and the priest pressed his palm to Cole's shoulder with the kind of blessing that carries the weight of witness. The rodons pulled patient as ribbon. Nita hummed in her tongue and sometimes sang under her breath, and Cole felt the bandage at his shoulder become less a declaration of injury than a reminder of new work to be done. The border town they reached was modest and cautious but offered what the priest had promised. Paper mattered, so people hired rather than traded. Nita found steady work mending nets and sewing. Her skill was welcomed by a captain's wife who treated her as labor, not chattel, and her laugh returned in small, steady measures, never erasing the past, only making space beside it. Cole took odd jobs, fixing fences, ferrying goods, and learned the economy of honest labor. He left a short note folded into the mission Bible, a few lines of gratitude tacked like a relic. As they crossed into the new county, the roadside staged small rebellions of color, wildflowers pushing through dust, a green shoot through cracked clay, and Cole felt, oddly and profoundly, that the ledger might be altered by steady hands on small deeds. They paused at the town's edge and looked back once, the chapel a white dot against the scrub, and then ahead to a market where a woman could work and be counted and a man could be paid without questions about ownership. It was not the end of reckoning, only a reprieve long enough to stitch new seams, roofs mended, cloths sewn, days counted in honest work, and for the first time in years both of them felt the fragile weight of hope that comes from choosing to stay and rebuild rather than run. Cole sat at the battered table in the mission's back room with a single candle and a sheet of paper that felt like the last honest place he had to speak. His hand trembled not from the shoulder wound but from the tenderness of finally trying to name a life he had carried in silence. He thought of Nita as he set the pen to the page, the way she had come out of dust barefoot and unbowed, the rope marks on her wrists, the quiet that had kept its own counsel. He thought of the river that had nearly taken them both and the canyon whose walls had returned gunfire like a choir of stone, and he tried to compress those brutal, bright images into a language small enough to fit on a single sheet. His first line was clumsy, a man's apology more than a sentence, and he crossed it out and started again, because names mattered in the truth of it would not be allowed to be sloppy. He wrote of the horse and how he had offered it, and of the moment she had reached for those reins and made him stop, and of the 5 words he had whispered that still sounded like a vow when he remembered them: ride with me instead. He told her about the way she had moved through the canyon as if the land spoke to her in a language he had not known to learn. and about the night the river had swallowed a pursuer and in doing so had bought them one more dawn. He wrote of the cabin where baby shoes turned to dust and of the locket she had found which had gleamed like a small sun between her fingers and reminded him, in a way words never did, of his own daughter. He admitted, with the crudeness of a man unused to confession, that he had killed in the war thinking he saw enemies in every shadow, and that the face of a boy he had shot haunted him still like a bell that would not stop ringing. He tried to make the letter do justice to what had happened in the arroyo when he had ridden in to find the men who traded in people, when shots had answered shots and he had taken a wound into his shoulder but had not stopped until the trade was ended. He did not seek to make himself a hero on the page. He wanted only to say the honest thing, that he had been given a choice and that in that moment he had tried to choose differently than his past had taught him. He wrote that Nita had prayed over his wound in a tongue he did not own and that her hands had steadied him in a way that felt more like mercy than any absolution he had ever earned at a barroom table. He wrote that when they buried the traitors under the red sky, she had refused his offer to take the horse and ride north alone, and that instead she had chosen to ride with him, echoing his words back as if to prove the world could sometimes keep its promises. He confessed that he had written this not because he believed paper could fix anything, but because placing a truth on a surface felt like completing a small, necessary ritual, an act that might make the ledger inside his chest shift by a degree. He folded the letter with hands steadier now for the work of it, and he tucked it into the crown of his hat, a gesture both private and holy in its simplicity. He rose and walked into the chapel, the candle burning low behind him, and he placed the hat and the folded letter upon the altar beside the priest's Bible, the hat a relic of the road and the letter a quiet promise to a child who would never read it. He left the note not because he thought it would reach the dead. He had learned the futility of that, but because some confessions must be left where witnesses exist, and a chapel and its priest were witnesses enough. He stood a moment in the doorway where the cool missionary met the warm night and felt the desert press close like a thing that listens, and he imagined the words carrying beyond wood and tile into the wide, patient dark. He remembered the line he had written and then underlined in a clumsy hand and folded into the seam, "She rides free now." He did not need to send it, because the desert already kept all its stories. The mesas and riverbeds and the canyon walls would remember what had been done, and the land had a way of cataloging mercy that no postman could improve upon. He lingered there, thinking of the girl he had lost and of all the small things that became proof of a life: left shoes, a ribbon, a voice that no longer answered. He wrote that he carried regret like a map folded into the spine of his ribs and that sometimes a simple action, offering a horse, could change the compass. He tried to find words for gratitude toward a woman who had saved him from himself, and the ink trembled as if it too had feeling. He remembered the old priest's hands, steady, brown, patient, and how the man had taught him that witness was its own sacrament, not loud but true. He left out certain confessions, the ones that would not soften no matter how many times he wrote them, because some debts cannot be spelled into peace. Still, he put down what he could: the horse's name, the hollow of the canyon where echoes kept secrets, the exact phrase he'd spoken that had become a covenant. The candle guttered low and he thought of the river spitting up silver under dawn, how a life can be rerouted by a single act of mercy or courage. He folded the page and for a long moment hesitated, thumb smoothing over his own handwriting as if the touch could make the words truer. Then he crossed the chapel threshold, laid the hat and the folded letter beside the Bible, and felt the weight of the gesture settle like dust on his shoulders. Outside he paused and listened. The desert seemed to answer, a wind that moved over ridges carrying with it the slow knowledge of what men had done. Dawn and us pulled across the plain in a ribbon of gold and ash, and they rode into that light as if crossing from one life to another. The world was spare and intimate, the hoofbeats a metronome, the wind a thin voice that braided itself through straps and reins, and that sound became the measure of everything that came after. Nita sat with the patient certainty of someone who had learned to hold grief without letting it crush her spine, each motion tempered by the years that had carved patience into her bones, her gaze forward, not unseeing but chosen. Cole rode with the slow concentration of a man who had learned to count the small things that keep life from falling apart: a tightened girth, a checked flank, a hand never far from a wound, a quiet that had been earned in the long years of running. They did not speak of the dead. The graves they had filled still sat like arguments behind them, small mounds the wind already argued over in low tones, and memory came upon them in slow waves: the river's cold hand, the canyon's shout, the smell of smoke in the arroyo, but instead of collapsing under those images, they folded them kindly into the weight of the day. Each mile forward became a ritual of ordinary holiness, a slow insistence that living could be a craft practiced with care rather than a frantic fleeing from the past. The land around them took its own measure of their vow and answered with small mercies. Scrub pushed new green from cracked soil, a lone cactus flower open to the thin sun. Birds uncurled their songs at the ridge as if approving this fragile truce. Their shadows stretched long and thin across the ground like pencil marks drawn by a hand that would not erase what had been written, and in that stretching the past seemed to remain behind them without losing all shape. Between them there was a soft tenting that needed no phrases. Cole adjusted a stirrup, Nita checked a cinch. Each motion was an unspoken sentence of trust. Sometimes she hummed under her breath in her tongue, a sound that floated over saddles like a benediction. Sometimes he breathed a wordless apology that felt more like a treaty than a prayer. The people they passed, farmhands hauling buckets, a woman pegging linen, looked with the curious politeness reserved for those who carry visible scars and would not ask the shape of the wounds. At a lone waste-top they shared water and thin bread, and Nita laughed once, a small, brittle thing that surprised them both by its warmth and by how much it mended what words could not. It was no cure. It was a stitch, a temporary repair that would hold for the next stretch of road. Cole watched her then with a reverence that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with recognition. He saw a survivor who would not let sorrow harden into hatred. She, in turn, watched him without forgetting the ledger of his faults, but she let his company be counted as evidence that a life could be altered by the steady choice to keep another alive. As they climbed a low divide, the border lay ahead, not as a line of law but as a thin hope, a place where paper and promise might finally hold more power than a crooked brand or the barter of human lives. And they did not imagine the future as erased pain but as work, small, repetitive, honest labor that might, over time, reroute the sharper edges of guilt into something like usefulness. The lesson that hung between them was both simple and scarce. Forgiveness cannot change what was done, but it tends what remains, and tending is the hardest, most courageous labor either of them had ever known. The sun rose higher, wiping the last chill from their shoulders, and for a long breath the desert felt like a witness that had leaned in to hear whether two broken people would choose to keep riding together. They rode on, no banners, no proclamations, only the stubborn, quiet decision to move forward despite the ledger in their chests. As the horizon brightened into a washed, sacred white, the narrator's voice came, soft as the wind that had followed them, asking not for an easy answer but for their conscience. If freedom costs a lifetime of guilt, would you still ride for it? If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.